Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Imagine walking through the streets of London in 1951. You step over piles of rubble from buildings that were homes just 6 years ago. The acrid smell of coal smoke mixes with the damp fog rolling in from the Thames. Around the corner, past the bombed-out shell of what used to be a department store, you hear music drifting from a basement club where teenagers in strange American-inspired clothes dance to a sound Britain has never heard before. A man in an expensive suit climbs out of a black car at the club's entrance, his presence commanding respect tinged with fear. This is not the London of tourist brochures or nostalgic memories. This is the real London of the 1950s, a city caught between devastation and rebirth, between grinding poverty and explosive new wealth, between the grey constraints of wartime sacrifice and the technicolor promise of something entirely new. The story they tell you about 1950s London is one of tea parties and proper manners of a stable society recovering gracefully from war. But the truth is far more compelling, far more complex, and infinitely more human. This was a decade when bomb craters still pockmarked the landscape, while the Festival of Britain promised a space-age future. It was a time when you might wait years for housing while gangsters drove luxury cars past your queue at the grocer. It was an era when rationing was actually worse than during the war itself, yet coffee bars were opening on every street corner in Soho, packed with young people who had money to spend. The 1950s in London weren't just a bridge between the war and the swinging 60s. They were a revolution in slow motion, a transformation hidden in plain sight, a decade that would reshape not just a city, but an entire culture. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, we're going to explore the London they don't talk about in the history books. The London of contradictions and secrets, of hope and despair, of innovation and decay. The London that gave birth to everything that followed. Let's begin where London itself began in the 1950s, amidst the ruins of total war. When people speak of wartime London, they picture the Blitz, the bombs falling in 1940 and 41, the heroic resistance of a city under siege. But those images, burned into cultural memory, tell only part of the story. The bombing didn't end in 1941. Throughout the war, and especially during the vengeful doodlebug attacks of 1944 and 1945, German rockets continued to rain down on London. These weren't the dramatic air raids of the early war announced by sirens, and followed by the communal experience of huddling in shelters. These were random, silent killings from the sky, V-2 rockets that struck, without warning, obliterating entire streets in seconds. By the time victory in Europe was declared in May 1945, London had been transformed into something closer to photographs of ancient ruins than a modern capital city. 30,000 Londoners lay dead from enemy action. 50,000 more carried injuries that would last a lifetime, both visible and invisible. But perhaps more devastating to daily life were the numbers that measured physical destruction. Over 250,000 houses had been completely destroyed. Another 250,000 were so severely damaged they couldn't be lived in. And this doesn't account for the hundreds of thousands more that had been hit but could, with difficulty and danger, still provide some form of shelter. When peace came, over 1.4 million people in London had no intact home to return to. Think about that for a moment. 1.4 million people without proper housing in a single city. Families crammed into damaged buildings with tarpaulins for roofs and planks of wood over gaping holes where windows used to be. Others lived in makeshift shelters in underground stations, not because bombs were falling anymore, but because there was simply nowhere else to go. The government had promised that victory would bring a return to normalcy, a restoration of the comfortable British life that people had been fighting to preserve. Instead, victory brought something more challenging, a landscape of rubble and ruin that seemed to stretch endlessly through the city's ancient streets. Walking through London in the late 1940s and early 50s meant navigating an urban disaster zone that had become eerily normalized. Children played in bomb craters as if they were natural features of the landscape. Weeds and wildflowers grew from the tops of destroyed buildings, creating vertical gardens of a sort London had never seen. Entire neighbourhoods simply ceased to exist, replaced by vast empty lots where people could still find fragments of their former lives, a doorknob from someone's home, a piece of china from a dining room set, photographs scattered and faded by rain. The City of London, the historic heart that had stood for nearly 2,000 years, was particularly devastated. Ancient churches that had survived the Great Fire of 1666 now stood as hollow shells, their medieval stones blackened by modern explosives. Wren's masterpieces, architectural jewels that had defined the London skyline for centuries, were reduced to picturesque ruins that the authorities didn't have the money or materials to repair. But it wasn't just the grand buildings and historic sites that suffered. The working-class neighbourhoods of the East End, already crowded and poor before the war, were hit catastrophically hard. Entire streets in Stepney, Poplar and Shoreditch had been wiped away. These weren't just buildings lost. These were communities destroyed, networks of neighbours and families who had lived side by side for generations, now scattered to the winds. The docks, which had been the economic engine of London for centuries, were decimated. Miles of warehouses reduced to twisted metal and broken brick. The Port of London, once the busiest in the world, operated at a fraction of its former capacity. The sounds of the docks, the shouts of stevedores, the grinding of cranes, the horns of ships, all of this was muted, reduced to a ghostly echo of what had been, and everywhere there was dust. The dust of pulverized buildings coated everything, got into everything. It was in your clothes, your food, your lungs. This dust was what remained of Victorian London, ground to powder by German high explosives. The government's response to this crisis was the prefab housing programme. Prefabricated houses, built quickly in factories and assembled on site, were supposed to be a temporary solution to get people out of shelters and into proper homes, while permanent housing could be built. The prefabs were interesting structures, surprisingly well designed for what they were. They had indoor bathrooms, something many working-class Londoners had never experienced. They had fitted kitchens, gardens, and modern amenities. The people who moved into them were often delighted, calling them the People's Palaces, with genuine affection. But there was never enough of them. The government had planned to build 500,000 prefabs. They managed less than 160,000 across the entire country, and many of those went to areas outside London. The shortages, the waiting lists, the desperate competition for housing, all of this created a psychological pressure that pervaded daily life in post-war London. Young couples couldn't get married because there was nowhere to live. Families with children were stuck in single rooms with shared outdoor toilets down the hall. Soldiers returning from years of service abroad found themselves homeless in the country they'd fought to defend. And if the housing situation was dire, the food situation was somehow even worse. This is what they really don't tell you about post-war Britain. Rationing during the 1950s was actually more severe than it had been during the war itself. Let that sink in. We had won the war, defeated fascism, saved civilization, and the reward was less food than we'd had when the bombs were falling. In 1946, for the first time in British history, bread was rationed. Bread, the staff of life, the most basic foodstuff, was now limited by government decree. This had never happened even in the darkest days of the Blitz. The reason was grimly practical. Britain was responsible for feeding not just its own population, but also the defeated German civilians in the British occupation zone. With American Lend-Lease aid cut off immediately after VE Day, and with most of Britain's agricultural workforce still demobilised, there simply wasn't enough food to go around. The weekly rations tell the story better than any statistics about economic recovery. In 1951, a full 6 years after the war ended, here's what you got. Each adult received 4 ounces of bacon per week. That's about 3 strips. 1.5 ounces of cheese, enough for perhaps 1 sandwich. 8 ounces of sugar, which sounds like a lot, until you realise it has to last a full week and cover all cooking and baking. 2 ounces of butter, barely enough to spread thinly on your morning toast. 2 ounces of tea, which for a nation that lived on tea was borderline inhumane. And meat was rationed by price rather than weight, with each adult getting about 1 shilling and twopence worth per week. This bought you perhaps enough mince for 1 small shepherd's pie, or a couple of sausages that were more bread filler than actual meat. Sweets and chocolate were rationed until February 1953. When the government tried to end sweet rationing in April 1949, there was such a rush on shops that they had to reimpose it by August. Children who grew up in this period remember a constant gnawing hunger that never quite went away. Not starvation, Britain wasn't facing famine, but a perpetual state of not quite enough that coloured every memory of childhood. Birthday parties without proper cake because there wasn't enough sugar or eggs. Christmas dinners that were more imagination than feast. The desperate creativity of mothers trying to make a tiny amount of meat stretch to feed a family, mixing it with anything they could find to bulk it out. Spam fritters, corned beef hash, mysterious pies where you couldn't quite identify what was supposed to be meat and what was filler. And all of this prepared on coal or gas that was also rationed, in kitchens that rarely had hot running water, and preserved in refrigerators that most families couldn't afford and wouldn't have for another decade. The psychological impact of this extended austerity was profound. Britain had won the war, but it felt like a hollow victory. While newspapers reported that Germany, the defeated enemy, was receiving Marshall Plan aid and rebuilding with American money, British citizens stood in line for hours to buy their meagre rations with money they didn't have. The government kept telling people to tighten their belts a bit longer, that recovery was just around the corner, that the sacrifices would soon pay off. But year after year, the rationing continued, the shortages persisted, the bomb sites remained empty lots because there was no money to rebuild, and increasingly people began to feel not like victors but like victims of their own victory. This sense of betrayal, of having sacrificed so much for so little, created a deep well of resentment that would shape British politics for a generation. The Conservative Party, out of power since 1945, seized on this frustration. Their campaign in the 1951 election was brutally simple. The Labour government had won the war but lost the peace. They'd nationalised industries but couldn't put food on people's plates. They'd created the National Health Service but couldn't build houses. The message resonated, and when Winston Churchill returned to power in October 1951, one of his first acts was telling. He ordered the demolition of something that had given people hope, however briefly. The Festival of Britain in 1951 was supposed to be many things: a celebration of the centenary of the Great Exhibition of 1851, a showcase of British innovation and culture, a promise that the future would be bright and modern and full of possibility. But more than anything, it was an attempt to lift the spirits of a nation that was, frankly, depressed. The festival's chief organiser, Herbert Morrison, understood that people were tired, discouraged, and desperately needed to believe that things would get better. The festival was meant to be that belief made physical, a vision of tomorrow built on the south bank of the Thames. And for 5 months in 1951, it worked. The main site of the festival occupied 27 acres of bombed-out industrial land on the south bank. This area had been a wasteland since the Blitz, a grim reminder of destruction in the very heart of London. The festival transformed it into something that looked like it had been transported from the future. The Dome of Discovery, 365 feet in diameter, was the largest dome in the world at the time. Inside, you could explore exhibitions about the polar regions, the ocean depths, outer space. For a nation that had been looking down at its feet, focused on the grey reality of daily survival, this encouraged people to look up, to imagine, to dream. Next to the dome stood the Sky Lawn, and this structure, more than anything else, captured what the festival was trying to say. The Sky Lawn was a vertical cigar-shaped tower, 90 metres tall, made of steel and aluminum. It appeared to float above the ground, held in place by nearly invisible tension cables. At night, lit from within, it could be seen across London, a beacon of modernity and optimism. Critics at the time joked that the Sky Lawn, like the British economy, had no visible means of support. But for many who saw it, it represented something more profound. The idea that Britain could defy gravity, could achieve the impossible, could rise above the ruins and become something extraordinary. The Royal Festival Hall, the only structure from the festival that still stands today, was revolutionary in its design. Modernist architecture wasn't common in Britain in 1951. Most public buildings were either Victorian leftovers or safe, conservative structures that wouldn't offend anyone's sensibilities. The Royal Festival Hall was different. It was bold, clean-lined, forward-looking. Inside, the acoustics were perfect, the sightlines unobstructed. It was designed by young architects who were given freedom to innovate, to experiment, to show what British design could be if freed from the constraints of tradition and austerity. Walking through the festival grounds was like stepping into a parallel universe where Britain hadn't lost its empire, hadn't nearly gone bankrupt, hadn't been bombed into submission. Here, everything was clean, new, optimistic. The colours were bright primaries, not the greys and browns that dominated daily life. The exhibits showcased British achievements in science, technology and the arts. There were televisions, which most people had never seen. There were jet engines, computers, innovations in everything from farming to manufacturing. For the 8.5 million people who visited the South Bank site, it was a revelation. This is what Britain could be. This is what we could build. This is the future we could create. But there was a poignant contrast between the festival and the city around it. You could spend a day marvelling at visions of tomorrow, then take the tube home to a neighbourhood still pockmarked with bomb craters, to a cramped flat with outdoor plumbing, to a dinner of rationed meat and powdered eggs. The festival was a dream, beautiful and inspiring, but when you woke up, the reality remained unchanged. And some people, particularly those on the political right, saw the festival as worse than useless. They saw it as an expensive distraction, a waste of money that could have been spent on housing or food or anything practical. They saw it as Labour propaganda, a socialist vision of a planned, managed society that they found both unrealistic and vaguely totalitarian. Winston Churchill, the war hero brought back to save Britain again, apparently shared this view. Within weeks of the Conservative victory in October 1951, Churchill ordered the festival site demolished. Everything except the Royal Festival Hall was torn down. The Dome of Discovery, the Skylon, all the pavilions and exhibits gone. The site stood empty for years, a muddy wasteland that seemed to mock the dreams it had briefly hosted. But the festival left something behind that couldn't be demolished. It planted an idea, particularly in the minds of young Londoners, that their city could be different, could be exciting, could be the centre of something new and vibrant. The festival introduced design concepts that would slowly filter into everyday life. The bright colours, the clean lines, the sense that modern didn't have to mean ugly or cold, and it established the South Bank as a cultural centre. Over the following decades, the National Theatre, the National Film Theatre, and other cultural institutions would cluster there, building on the foundation the festival had laid. The demolition of the festival site was Churchill's first act as Prime Minister, but it wasn't his most consequential decision. That would come in the early 1950s, as he grappled with the economic crisis he'd inherited. The Conservative promise had been to end austerity, to get Britain moving again. But the government found what Labour had discovered, that promises are easier than policy, and good intentions don't fill empty stomachs or build destroyed houses. Rationing would continue for several more years. Full recovery was still distant, but something was beginning to change in London, not in government policy or economic statistics, but in the streets and clubs and coffee bars where a different kind of revolution was brewing. While politicians debated housing policy and economic recovery, while families struggled with ration books and waiting lists, a different London was emerging in the narrow streets and dark basements of Soho. This square mile of central London, bounded by Oxford Street to the north and Leicester Square to the south, was becoming the most exciting place in Britain. Soho had always been different, a bit louche, a bit dangerous, a haven for immigrants, artists, and anyone who didn't quite fit into respectable British society. But in the 1950s, Soho transformed into something unprecedented in British culture, the birthplace of modern British youth culture, the epicentre of a social revolution that would reshape the nation. The transformation began with coffee. Coffee wasn't unknown in Britain before the 1950s, but it wasn't common either. Tea was the national drink, rationed but available, familiar and comforting. Coffee was exotic, expensive, and difficult to make well with the equipment most people had. But Italian immigrants in Soho knew coffee differently. They knew espresso, that intense, rich extraction of flavour that could be made quickly and consistently with the right machine. In 1953, Italian film star Gina Lollobrigida officially opened the Mocha Bar on Frith Street, featuring London's first Gaggia espresso machine. The machine itself was a marvel, all gleaming chrome and hissing steam, looking more like something from a science fiction story than a kitchen appliance. The coffee it produced was unlike anything most Londoners had ever tasted. Strong, aromatic, served in tiny cups with a layer of creamer on top. Almost overnight, coffee bars began appearing throughout Soho. Not cafes in the genteel British sense, but Italian-style bars where you stood at the counter, tossed back a quick espresso, and got on with your day. Or, increasingly, where you lingered for hours, nursing a single cup because the establishments didn't have alcohol licenses and couldn't throw you out for not drinking enough. These coffee bars became gathering places for a new generation that had grown up during the war, but come of age in its aftermath. They were too young to have fought, too young to remember peacetime normalcy. They'd known only rationing, only austerity, only the grey, constrained Britain of the post-war years, and they were restless, hungry for something different, for colour and excitement and experiences their parents' generation couldn't understand. The coffee bars gave them a place to congregate, to talk, to develop their own culture separate from the exhausted, battle-weary world of their parents. The Tui's Coffee Bar on Old Compton Street became legendary. Its tiny 18-inch stage hosted musicians who were experimenting with sounds Britain had never heard before. Skiffle, a folky, bluesy music that came from America, became hugely popular. You could make a skiffle band with whatever you had, a guitar, a washboard for percussion, a tea-chest bass. It was democratic, accessible, exciting. Tommy Steele, Cliff Richard, and dozens of other musicians who would define British pop music got their start performing in sweaty basement coffee bars to audiences of teenagers who'd scraped together enough money for a single espresso. But the coffee bars were just the accessible face of Soho's nightlife. Deeper in, hidden down alleyways and behind unmarked doors, were the jazz clubs. Jazz in 1950s, Britain was revolutionary music, associated with black American culture, with freedom and improvisation and a looseness that was the opposite of buttoned-up British reserve. The Flamingo Club on Wardour Street ran all night, drawing black musicians, Caribbean immigrants, and young white Londoners who were hungry for authenticity, for rawness, for something that felt real in a way that nothing in mainstream British culture did. American GIs stationed in Britain frequented these clubs, bringing with them records, fashion ideas, and a casual confidence that British youth found magnetic. Here, black and white mixed freely in a way that was still shocking to many in 1950s Britain. Here, the music was so loud you felt it in your chest, and the dancing was uninhibited in a way that would have horrified your parents if they could see you. Then there was the Colony Room on Dean Street, a private members' club run by Muriel Belcher. The Colony was tiny, crowded, decorated in nothing special green, and absolutely legendary. This was where Francis Bacon drank himself into creative furies, where writers, poets, painters, and LGBTQ Londoners found a haven from a society that criminalised and ostracised them. Muriel herself was notorious for her sharp tongue and complete acceptance of anyone interesting, regardless of their background or inclinations. In an era when homosexuality could get you imprisoned, the Colony Room was a space where you could be yourself, at least for a few hours. The club's atmosphere was thick with cigarette smoke, strong drink, brilliant conversation, and the sense that you were part of something special, a hidden London that existed parallel to the official version. Soho's nightlife wasn't just clubs and coffee bars. The district had a long history as London's red light area, and sex work was openly visible on the streets. Prostitutes, known as working girls, walked openly on street corners, particularly around Brewer Street and Berwick Street. They'd call out to passing men, negotiating prices and services with a directness that shocked foreign visitors. The 1959 Street Offences Act would eventually drive this trade indoors, but through most of the 1950s, it was simply part of the landscape. You'd walk past these women on your way to the theatre or a restaurant, and they were as much a part of Soho as the Italian restaurants or the jazz clubs. Strip clubs operated openly, offering shows that ranged from artistic burlesque to more explicit performances. The theatres advertised their shows with photos in the windows, images of semi-nude women that would cause children to be hurried past by scandalised parents. There was something called the Soho Bibles, handmade pornographic magazines that were sold under the counter in pubs and clubs. Not the mass-produced pornography that would come later, but crudely printed booklets with photographs that were shocking, precisely because in 1950s Britain, such images were essentially impossible to see anywhere else. All of this, the sex industry, the gambling dens that operated behind false storefronts, the drinking clubs that got around licensing laws by calling themselves bottle parties, created an atmosphere where the normal rules didn't quite apply. This attracted not just artists and bohemians, but also criminals. And in 1950s Soho, the boundaries between legitimate businessmen, creative artists, and dangerous criminals were porous at best. You might see a respected actor having a drink at the same bar as a known gangster. A photographer who worked for fashion magazines might be at the same party as someone who ran protection rackets. The owner of a nightclub that catered to high society might also be taking money from prostitutes working the streets outside. This mixing of high and low, legal and illegal, respectable and disreputable, gave Soho its particular charge. It was a place where a working-class kid from the East End could end up sitting next to a member of Parliament, where a black musician from the Caribbean could be treated with more respect than he'd get anywhere else in Britain, where a young woman could experience a degree of freedom that would be impossible in her suburban home, where a gay man could find community and acceptance in a society that officially regarded him as a criminal. Soho in the 1950s was where London came alive after dark, where the stifling propriety of British society loosened its grip, where you could glimpse a different way of being, and increasingly young people from across London and beyond were drawn to this magnetic square mile, searching for something they couldn't name but knew they needed. The young people flooding into Soho's coffee bars and clubs in the mid-1950s were part of a broader phenomenon that was both fascinating and terrifying to the older generation. For the first time in British history, there was such a thing as a teenager. The word itself was American, imported to Britain in the early 1950s, and it described something new, a distinct phase of life between childhood and adulthood, with its own culture, its own fashions, its own values. Before the war, you were a child, then you were an adult. You left school at 14 or 15 and went to work. You wore smaller versions of adult clothes, then adult clothes. There was no in-between, no separate identity. But the post-war generation was different. Many stayed in school longer due to education reforms. National service for young men wouldn't end until 1960, but that was still in the future. And besides, military service itself often exposed young men to new ideas and experiences they brought back to civilian life. Most importantly, teenagers in 1950s. Britain had money in a way previous generations hadn't. With near full employment and labour shortages, even young workers could find jobs that paid decent wages. And unlike adults with families to support and bills to pay, teenagers could spend their money on themselves, on clothes and music and going out. Market researchers calculated that teenagers had tremendous spending power, and advertisers quickly realized this new demographic was worth targeting. This economic independence gave young people the ability to create their own culture, to buy the things that defined them as different from their parents, and nowhere was this difference more visible than in the emergence of the teddy boys. The teddy boys, or Teds, first appeared in London working-class neighbourhoods in 1953. Their name came from Edwardian, but their style was far from historically accurate. They wore long draped jackets with velvet collars, drain-pipe trousers, thick-soled shoes called creepers, and their hair styled in elaborate pompadours with long sideburns. The look was inspired by American gangster movies and zoot suit fashion, combined with a highly stylized version of Edwardian upper-class dress. The effect was simultaneously elegant and threatening, a working-class appropriation of aristocratic style filtered through American rebelliousness. But it wasn't just the clothes that defined the Teds, it was their attitude. They were loud, confrontational, territorial. They formed gangs that controlled specific areas, particularly in South and East London. They congregated at milk bars and early rock and roll shows, and they had a reputation for violence that sparked moral panic across Britain. Newspapers ran endless stories about teddy boy gangs attacking innocent people, smashing up cinemas, engaging in teddy boy riots that threatened social order. Most of this was exaggerated. The statistics on juvenile crime didn't actually show any dramatic increase. What had increased was police attention to working-class youth and media sensationalism about their behaviour. But the moral panic was real, fed by a deep anxiety in British society about what was happening to its young people. When Bill Haley and the Comets' Rock Around the Clock was featured in the film Blackboard Jungle in 1955, the reaction in British cinemas was unprecedented. Teenagers, many of them teddy boys, got up and danced in the aisles. They cheered, they stomped, they tore up seats. Not everywhere, not even in most screenings, but enough that newspapers reported a national crisis. Rock and roll music, they declared, was turning British youth into violent delinquents. What was really happening was more complex and more interesting than simple delinquency. Working-class teenagers, born during or just after the war, raised in austerity and told constantly to sacrifice for the common good, were discovering that they didn't have to live the way their parents did. They didn't have to be deferential to the upper classes. They didn't have to accept a future of factory work and cramped council flats. They could create their own identity, their own style, their own rules. The music was crucial to this transformation. Rock and roll, when it finally broke through in Britain in the mid-50s, wasn't just entertainment. It was a sound that matched the energy and frustration and rebellious spirit of a generation. It was loud, sexual, aggressive, everything that polite British society wasn't supposed to be. And it was American, which gave it an exotic appeal in a Britain that was simultaneously resentful of American dominance and fascinated by American culture. The Two Eyes Coffee Bar became ground zero for British rock and roll. Musicians who'd grown up on a diet of Lonnie Donegan's skiffle suddenly heard Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry. They tried to copy these sounds with whatever instruments they could get their hands on. The results were often rough, technically limited, but filled with an energy that was undeniable. Tommy Steele, discovered at the Two Eyes in 1956, became Britain's first rock and roll star. He wasn't as good as the American originals, but he was British, he was accessible, and he proved it was possible. Cliff Richard, Joe Brown, and others followed, creating a homegrown rock scene that would eventually produce the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the British Invasion. But before any of that, in the mid to late 50s, there was just this raw energy, these working-class kids in coffee bars and youth clubs playing music that their parents hated, wearing clothes that scandalized respectable society, and generally behaving in ways that suggested the old rules no longer applied. Parents and social commentators struggled to understand what was happening. Psychiatrists were consulted, sociologists wrote worried articles, politicians gave speeches about declining moral standards. The Church of England issued statements about the corrupting influence of American culture. This, generational anxiety, wasn't entirely irrational. The Teddy Boys were genuinely involved in violence, particularly against each other and against immigrants. The Notting Hill race riots of 1958, where white youths attacked Caribbean immigrants, involved Teddy Boy gangs prominently. These were ugly, racist attacks that revealed the darker side of working-class youth culture. But the broader fear was about change itself, about a generation that didn't automatically respect authority, that questioned the class system, that wanted more from life than what their parents had accepted. The very existence of the teenager as a distinct category threatened the social order. If young people could make their own choices, create their own culture, who knew where it might lead? And underneath all the hand-wringing and moral panic, there was perhaps an unspoken recognition that these young people had a point. They'd been born into, or just after, a catastrophic war they didn't cause. They were growing up in a country that was supposed to have won but felt like it had lost. They were told to wait patiently for things to get better while their youth ticked away. Why shouldn't they grab what joy and excitement they could? Why shouldn't they create something new instead of accepting the grey austerity of their elders? These questions didn't have good answers, and that uncertainty made the teenage phenomenon even more threatening to the established order. But if the Teddy Boys scared the middle class with their velvet-collared insolence and rock and roll, there were others in 1950s London who operated on a completely different level of menace. Others who mixed seamlessly with high society while building criminal empires in the shadows. Others whose influence would define the darker side of the decade and whose legend would outlast their lives. The Kray twins were born in October 1933, 10 minutes apart, in the hardscrabble East End neighbourhood of Hoxton. Ronnie and Reggie grew up in a world of grinding poverty made worse by the Depression, in a family where violence was commonplace and crime was often a necessity for survival. Their grandfather, Jimmy Cannonball Lee, had been a boxer, and he pushed the twins into the sport young. They showed genuine talent, becoming amateur champions, known in the boxing clubs of East London as tough, skilled fighters, who moved with an almost telepathic coordination when they worked together. But boxing was just training for their real calling. By the early 1950s, while the Teddy Boys were shocking suburbia with their draped jackets and pompadours, the Kray twins were building something far more organised and far more dangerous. They bought a rundown snooker club in Mile End with money from their early criminal activities. This became their headquarters, the place where they ran protection rackets that were simple in concept but devastating in execution. You paid the Krays for protection, and they ensured nothing bad happened to your business. If you didn't pay, bad things happened, very bad things, and everyone knew the Krays had caused them. Shop owners, pub landlords, garage proprietors all learned that resistance was futile and dangerous. The Krays' reputation for extreme violence meant that most people paid up without argument. Those who didn't became object lessons in what happened when you defied them. By the mid-1950s, the twins had moved beyond simple protection rackets. They were involved in armed robbery, arson, hijacking trucks. Their gang, which they called the Firm, was recruiting members, some voluntarily, some through intimidation. If you crossed them and survived, you might find yourself being offered a place in their organisation. Refusal wasn't really an option. Ronnie, always more volatile than his brother, was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia after being imprisoned in the late 50s. His violent outbursts were becoming more frequent and more severe. He attacked a man with a bayonet in one incident that got him a 3-year prison sentence. In jail, his mental instability became impossible to ignore, but the diagnosis didn't stop his criminal career. If anything, it made him more dangerous, less predictable, more willing to use extreme violence to solve even minor disputes. What made the Krays different from ordinary East End criminals, what elevated them to legendary status even during the 1950s, when they were still building their empire, was their ability to move between worlds. They owned nightclubs, starting with a rundown billiard hall and eventually acquiring classier venues in the West End. These clubs catered to celebrities, wealthy businessmen, and anyone who wanted the thrill of rubbing shoulders with real gangsters while feeling safe in their expensive suits. By the late 1950s, the Krays were hosting Frank Sinatra when he came to London. They'd meet with famous actors and singers who found them charming, dangerous, fascinating. They photographed well the twins, always impeccably dressed in dark suits and skinny ties, their hair slicked back, their manner polite and almost courtly unless you crossed them. This dual identity, vicious East End criminals and West End nightclub owners, allowed the Krays to build networks that protected them from consequences. They had police officers on their payroll. They had politicians who owed them favours or were compromised by their connections to the twins. They had powerful friends who could make problems disappear. Throughout the 1950s, as they steadily built their empire, the Krays were essentially untouchable. Witnesses were too terrified to testify. Evidence mysteriously disappeared. Anyone who might have talked had reasons, violent reasons, to stay silent. The Krays represented something dark in 1950s London, the underside of the prosperity that was slowly arriving, the corruption that existed beneath the surface of respectable society. They showed how the class system could be manipulated, how working-class boys with nothing but ruthlessness and style could end up wielding power that rivaled anyone's. They proved that in London's underworld, violence and charisma could open any door, gain access to any circle. Their story was still being written in the late 1950s. The worst was yet to come, the murders and the fall and the life sentences. But their presence in the decade, their success in building a criminal empire, while London was supposedly recovering and rebuilding, reveals something about the reality beneath the official narrative. Not everyone was patiently waiting for prosperity to trickle down. Some were taking what they wanted, consequences be damned, and in the shadows of the nightclubs they controlled, in the back rooms where deals were made and threats were delivered, the Krays and men like them were shaping a London that guidebooks never mentioned. While the Krays were building their empire in the East End and establishing their presence in West End nightlife, another transformation was underway in London that would prove equally significant, though far less sinister. The 1950s saw the beginning of large-scale immigration from the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent, waves of people who would fundamentally change the character of the city. They came seeking opportunity in the mother country, and they found instead a mixture of hope and hostility that would take generations to fully navigate. The Empire Windrush docked at Tilbury in June 1948, carrying 492 passengers from Jamaica. This wasn't the first arrival of Caribbean immigrants to Britain, far from it, but it became symbolically important, the marker of a new chapter in British history. The British Nationality Act of 1948 had granted citizenship to all people living in British colonies and former colonies. This was partly idealistic, a vision of a united Commonwealth, but it was also practical. Britain needed workers. The post-war boom required labour that the depleted British population couldn't fully provide. Caribbean men and women, many of whom had served in the British military during the war, saw an opportunity. They'd been told all their lives about the mother country, the heart of the empire. Now they had the legal right to come to Britain, to work, to build lives. So they came, first in hundreds, then in thousands, then in tens of thousands, as the 1950s progressed. What they found was a Britain that simultaneously needed them and resented them. The labour shortage was real. London Transport actively recruited in Barbados and Jamaica, offering jobs as bus drivers and conductors. The newly formed National Health Service desperately needed nurses and recruited heavily in the Caribbean. Hotels, restaurants, factories all were hiring, and Caribbean workers filled positions that would have otherwise gone unfilled. They worked hard, often taking jobs British workers didn't want, working night shifts and difficult hours, accepting wages that were low by British standards but better than what they could earn back home. They sent money to families in the Caribbean. They saved toward futures they hoped would justify the sacrifice of leaving everything familiar. But Britain in the 1950s, particularly London, was not prepared for racial diversity on this scale. There had always been small communities of black Britons, in port cities particularly, but these were tiny, marginalised, easy to overlook. The arrival of thousands of Caribbean immigrants made them impossible to ignore, and the reaction from much of white British society ranged from uncomfortable to openly hostile. Many landlords refused to rent to black tenants. Signs in windows reading, "No blacks, no dogs, no Irish," were common enough that they became infamous. Caribbean immigrants often ended up in the worst housing in the most run-down neighbourhoods, places that were barely habitable but were the only options available. Multiple families might share a single house with everyone working different shifts, so the beds were never cold, passed from one sleeper to the next. In Notting Hill, in Brixton, in parts of the East End, Caribbean communities began to form, not by choice but by necessity. This was where they were allowed to live, where landlords, often exploitative slumlords like the notorious Peter Rashman, would rent to them at inflated prices. Employment discrimination was blatant. Despite the labour shortage, many employers would hire Caribbean workers only for the worst jobs, the ones no one else wanted. Promotion was nearly impossible regardless of skill or experience, and beyond the practical difficulties, there was the daily experience of racism, from casual slurs shouted on the street to more organised violence. The Notting Hill race riots in August and September 1958 were a flashpoint, though calling them riots masks what they really were: sustained racist attacks by white mobs, including teddy boy gangs, on Caribbean residents. Houses were firebombed, people were beaten in the streets. The police response was inadequate at best, and many in the Caribbean community felt the authorities sympathised more with the white attackers than with the black victims. But alongside and despite this hostility, Caribbean immigrants were establishing themselves, creating communities, making contributions that London couldn't have managed without them. The music they brought with them, calypso, ska, the early forms of reggae, began to filter into British culture. Clubs in Notting Hill and elsewhere featured Caribbean bands. Sound systems, a Jamaican innovation where DJs would play records through massive speaker setups, began appearing at parties and dances. This would eventually evolve into British reggae and, later, into grime and other uniquely British musical forms. Caribbean food began to appear in areas where Caribbean communities lived. Jamaican patties, rice and peas, curry goat, these became available in ways they never had been before. Restaurants and small shops catering to Caribbean tastes opened, and over time, white Londoners who lived near these areas began to try the food, to develop tastes for these new flavors. The process was slow, and it would be decades before Caribbean food became anything like mainstream, but the seeds were planted in the 1950s. Indian and Pakistani immigration followed a similar pattern. The partition of India and Pakistan in 1947 had created millions of refugees, and many saw Britain as a destination. By the mid-1950s, immigrants from the Indian subcontinent were arriving in increasing numbers, also drawn by employment opportunities and the legal right to settle in Britain. Like Caribbean immigrants, they faced discrimination in housing and employment. Like Caribbean immigrants, they congregated in areas where they were tolerated, creating communities where they could maintain their languages, religions, and cultural practices while adapting to British life. And like Caribbean immigrants, they filled crucial roles in the British economy, working in foundries, in textile mills, in shops and restaurants. The diversity these immigrants brought to London was often invisible to the wider British public in the 1950s. The Caribbean and South Asian communities were concentrated in specific areas, and most white Londoners could live their entire lives without significant contact with the new arrivals. This would change, of course. By the swinging 60s, the cultural contributions of immigrant communities would become more visible, more influential. But in the 1950s, these were mostly separate worlds, overlapping but not yet integrated, each struggling to understand the other. The presence of thousands of non-white residents in a city that had been overwhelmingly white challenged fundamental assumptions about British identity. Who was truly British? Could you be black or brown and British? These questions, so obvious now, were genuinely contested in 1950s Britain, and the lack of good answers, the discomfort with even asking the questions, created tensions that would periodically erupt into violence. Immigration in the 1950s planted seeds that would grow into the multicultural Britain of today, but that growth was painful, contested, marked by injustice and resistance. The Caribbean nurses who kept the NHS functioning, the Sikh workers who kept London's factories running, the Pakistani shopkeepers who stayed open long hours serving their neighbourhoods. These people built modern London as surely as the architects and planners. But their contributions were rarely acknowledged, often resented, and their presence continued to spark debates about British identity that have never been fully resolved. As the 1950s progressed toward their close, something remarkable was happening in Britain. The austere, rationed, bombed-out country of the late 40s was transforming into something wealthier, more comfortable, more confident. The change wasn't dramatic, it wasn't sudden, but by 1954, when rationing finally ended, by 1957, when Harold Macmillan declared that Britons had never had it so good, it was undeniable. Britain was recovering, or at least parts of Britain were recovering, and London, as always, led the way. The end of rationing in July 1954 was genuinely momentous. For 14 years, British people had been told what they could and couldn't buy, how much they could eat, what they were allowed to have. An entire generation had grown up knowing nothing but ration books and queues and making do. When meat rationing ended, the last of the wartime restrictions to be lifted, there was a sense of liberation that's hard to overstate. You could go to a butcher shop and buy as much meat as you could afford. You could bake a cake with real butter and actual eggs, as much as you wanted. You could give your children sweets without calculating whether you had enough coupons left. This seems trivial now, but in 1954, it felt like freedom. The economy was genuinely improving. Unemployment remained remarkably low, around 3% through most of the 50s. If you wanted a job, you could find one. Wages were rising faster than prices, which meant people had more money to spend, and spend they did. The consumer boom of the late 50s was modest compared to what would come later, but for people who'd lived through war and austerity, it felt like wealth beyond imagination. Television ownership exploded. In 1950, less than 2% of British households had a television. The 1953 coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, watched by millions on televisions bought or rented specifically for the event, proved the medium's power. By the end of the 50s, over 75% of households had TV access. This wasn't just entertainment, though it was certainly that. It was a window into a wider world, a shared national experience. Families would gather around their sets to watch the same programs, creating a common cultural reference point that hadn't existed before. Commercial television began in 1955, breaking the BBC's monopoly and introducing advertising to British screens. Critics worried this would corrupt British culture with American-style commercialism, and they weren't entirely wrong, but they also couldn't stop it. People liked having choices. They liked seeing advertisements for products they might actually buy. They liked programs designed to entertain rather than educate. Commercial TV was popular because it gave people what they wanted, and what they wanted was often just to be amused and diverted after long days of work. Consumer goods that had been luxuries or impossibilities in the 40s became common in the 50s. Washing machines meant housewives didn't spend entire days scrubbing clothes by hand. Refrigerators meant food lasted longer, and shopping didn't have to be a daily chore. Vacuum cleaners, electric irons, kitchen appliances of all kinds, these started appearing in homes across London. Not all homes. The working class still struggled, but enough homes that you could see the difference. The advertising industry grew to match the consumer boom. Magazines, newspapers, television, all were filled with advertisements for the new products that could make your life easier, better, more modern. Buy this washing machine and have time for yourself. Buy this car and have freedom. Buy these clothes and be attractive, sophisticated, part of the new prosperous Britain. The messages were simple, seductive, and effective. Hire purchase agreements, a form of installment buying, made it possible to own things you couldn't afford to buy outright. You could take a washing machine home today and pay for it over the next year. This seemed miraculous to people whose parents had saved for years to buy anything substantial. It also created debt loads that would become problematic. But in the late 50s, that was a future concern. For now, you could have what you wanted when you wanted it. The car culture that would define the 60s began in the late 50s. Car ownership doubled during the decade. The streets of London began filling with more private vehicles, creating the traffic problems that plague the city today. But for those who could afford a car, the freedom was intoxicating. You weren't dependent on public transport. You could take weekend trips, visit the countryside, go where you wanted, when you wanted. The Ford Anglia, the Morris Minor, the Austin A40, these modest cars represented freedom and modernity to families who'd never owned a vehicle before. Housing was improving too. The crash program of the early 50s, when the Conservative government promised to build 300,000 houses a year, mostly succeeded. New housing estates sprang up around London. New towns like Harlow and Stevenage were planned and built, designed to relieve London's overcrowding while providing modern housing with gardens and green spaces. Not everyone liked these developments. The tower blocks built in the late 50s would later become notorious for crime, isolation, and social problems. But initially they seemed like progress. Families moved from slums to modern flats with indoor plumbing, central heating, fitted kitchens. Whatever problems would come later, in the late 50s this felt like moving into the future. American cultural influence was pervasive, both celebrated and resented. American films dominated British cinemas. American music, rock and roll especially, captured British youth. American styles, from teenage fashion to advertising techniques, were imported wholesale. This created anxieties about Britain losing its identity, becoming a cultural colony of America. These weren't baseless fears. American economic and military power overshadowed Britain's declining empire. The Suez Crisis in 1956, when America forced Britain to back down from military action in Egypt, made Britain's diminished status painfully clear. Britain wasn't a superpower anymore. It was a medium-sized power struggling to maintain relevance. But while politicians and intellectuals worried about decline, ordinary Londoners increasingly embraced American culture. If America was confident and prosperous, while Britain was anxious and still recovering, why not adopt American styles? Why not listen to American music, watch American films, copy American fashions? This wasn't lack of patriotism. It was pragmatic. American culture offered an alternative to the class-bound, tradition-heavy, often stuffy nature of British culture. It offered the promise that you could be whoever you wanted, that your background didn't determine your future. These were seductive ideas in a Britain that was still deeply stratified by class. By the end of the 50s, London was a different city than it had been a decade earlier. The bomb craters were mostly filled in. The economy was growing. People had money to spend. A youth culture was emerging that would explode into the swinging 60s. But underneath the prosperity, tensions remained. Class divisions hadn't disappeared, they'd just taken on new forms. Racial tensions simmered in areas with large immigrant populations. The gangsters who'd prospered during austerity adapted to prosperity, finding new ways to profit from society's desires. And many of the old problems, poor housing, inadequate public services, economic inequality, persisted despite the overall improvement. The Britain, the London of the late 50s, was a work in progress, better than what had come before but far from perfect. And it was poised on the edge of an explosion of culture and change that would make it the centre of the world's attention. While London's economy improved and consumerism took hold, there was another story of the 1950s that's often overlooked, the experience of women during this decade. The 1950s are frequently portrayed as a golden age of domesticity, when women happily embraced their roles as housewives and mothers, finding fulfillment in modern kitchens and well-ordered homes. The reality was far more complex and far less comfortable than this nostalgic image suggests. During World War II, women had taken on roles that were previously considered exclusively male. They'd worked in factories making munitions. They'd served in the military in non-combat roles. They'd driven trucks, operated machinery, done heavy labour. They'd proved they were capable of anything men could do. And many had enjoyed the independence, the sense of purpose, the feeling that they were contributing to something larger than themselves. Then the war ended, the men came home, and women were strongly encouraged to return to domestic life. The government needed jobs for returning soldiers, and the easiest solution was to push women out of the workforce. Propaganda that had urged women to work for the war effort pivoted seamlessly to urging them to return home for the peace. Your country needs you to make room for the boys coming back. Your family needs you to create a stable home. You'll be happier as a wife and mother than you could ever be in a factory or office. These messages were everywhere, in films, in magazines, in advertisements, in advice from doctors and educators and clergy. Many women did return to full-time domesticity, some eagerly, some with relief, many with conflicting feelings they weren't encouraged to express. But domestic life in 1950s Britain, especially in the early 50s during continued austerity, was grueling in ways that modern people struggle to imagine. Most homes didn't have hot running water. That didn't arrive until the late 50s for many working-class families. This meant boiling water on the stove for washing dishes, washing clothes, bathing children. Washing machines were rare until the late 50s. Laundry was done by hand, scrubbed on washboards, wrung out by hand, hung to dry outside or in cramped flats. This took hours, an entire day each week dedicated to washing. Cooking was done on coal or gas stoves that required constant attention. You couldn't just set a temperature and leave food to cook. You had to constantly monitor, adjust, tend, and you were cooking with limited ingredients, rationed food, trying to make appetizing meals from what you could get. There were no supermarkets until the late 50s. Shopping meant going to multiple shops, the butcher, the grocer, the baker, standing in queues carrying heavy bags home. This was daily work, not weekly. Food didn't keep without refrigeration, and most families didn't have refrigerators. House cleaning with none of the modern conveniences we take for granted. Carpets beaten outside rather than vacuumed. Floors scrubbed on hands and knees. Windows washed, laundry done, meals prepared, children tended, all without labour-saving devices, all day, every day. This wasn't the pleasant domesticity of advertisements. This was hard physical labour, as demanding as any factory job, performed in isolation, unpaid, unacknowledged as real work. The ideal housewife of 1950s imagery was always immaculately dressed, makeup perfect, home spotless, children well-behaved, husband welcomed with a smile at the end of the day. Achieving this ideal while dealing with rationing, inadequate housing, minimal conveniences was essentially impossible. But women were told they should achieve it, that this was their role, their duty, their path to fulfillment. The psychological toll was significant. Women who'd experienced independence and purpose during the war found domesticity stifling. Women who struggled with housework felt like failures because it was supposed to be natural, something women instinctively knew how to do well. The isolation was profound. If your husband worked and your children went to school, you might spend entire days alone, seeing no one, speaking to no one. Mental health issues were common but rarely discussed. Depression was seen as personal weakness rather than a legitimate condition. Women suffered in silence, unable to admit they were unhappy in roles they were supposed to find fulfilling. Many women did work outside the home in the 1950s, but this was rarely celebrated or even acknowledged. Working-class women often had no choice but to work. Single mothers, widows, families where one income wasn't enough, all required women's earnings to survive. But women's work was consistently undervalued. They were paid less than men for the same work. They were relegated to the least prestigious jobs. Secretarial work, nursing, teaching, retail. These were women's jobs. Important, but seen as less important than men's work. Promotion was rare. Management positions were almost exclusively male. A woman who was too competent, too ambitious, too unwilling to accept her subordinate position was seen as unfeminine, problematic, someone to be avoided or suppressed. Marriage bars still existed in many professions. Women teachers, for example, were often required to resign when they married, on the assumption they'd be starting families and wouldn't be able to fully commit to their work. This seems absurd now, but in the 1950s, it was considered reasonable. Marriage and motherhood were incompatible with serious careers. If you wanted a career, you remained single. If you married, you gave up professional ambitions. The choice seemed stark and unfair, and it was, but most women made it without complaint because there was no alternative. Some women found ways to navigate these constraints, to carve out spaces for themselves. The bohemian world of Soho, the jazz clubs and coffee bars, offered more freedom for women than conventional society did. Women artists, writers, and musicians could find community and acceptance there. But this was a tiny minority. Most women weren't bohemians. They were ordinary women trying to make lives within very limited options. The women's movement that would explode in the 1960s, demanding equality and rights and respect, was born partly from the frustrations of the 1950s. The daughters of 50s housewives watched their mothers' constrained lives and decided they wanted something different. The anger that had been suppressed, the ambitions that had been thwarted, the intelligence and capability that had been wasted, all of this would eventually find expression. But in the 1950s themselves, most women endured rather than rebelled. They made do, they managed, they found small pleasures where they could. They created communities with other women, networks of support that helped them survive, and they shaped the next generation, consciously or unconsciously, preparing their daughters for lives different from their own. The story of women in 1950s London is one of constraint and endurance, of gifts wasted and potential unrealized. But it's also a story of quiet resistance, of women maintaining their sense of self despite constant pressure to conform, of mothers planting seeds of rebellion in their daughters. The revolution that would transform women's lives was coming, but it was still a decade away. In the 1950s, women mostly waited, worked, endured, and hoped for something better. As the 1950s drew to a close, London stood on the threshold of transformation. The decade that had begun with rubble and rationing was ending with prosperity and possibility. The economy was booming, unemployment was vanishingly low, consumer goods were flooding the market, and a generation of young people was coming of age with expectations their parents had never had. The seeds planted throughout the 50s would bloom spectacularly in the 60s, making London the cultural capital of the world, the epicenter of music, fashion, and revolutionary ideas. But those seeds needed the soil of the 50s to grow in. The 1950s had been dismissed, even during the decade itself, as a boring interlude between the drama of the war years and the excitement of the 60s, grey, conformist, conservative, nothing much happening, just recovery and rebuilding. But that was never true. Beneath the surface calm, beneath the apparent stability, everything was changing. Youth culture, born in the coffee bars and jazz clubs of Soho, was becoming a force that couldn't be contained. The Teddy Boys, scandalous in the mid-50s, seemed tame by 1959 compared to what was coming. Rock and roll, initially a shocking American import, was being absorbed and transformed by British musicians who would soon teach America about rock music. The class system, supposedly eternal and unshakable, was being undermined by economic changes that gave working-class kids opportunities for education and advancement. Grammar schools and university scholarships were producing a generation of working-class intellectuals who would reshape British culture. Meanwhile, the old upper classes were losing their grip, their wealth diminished by taxation, their authority questioned by people who no longer automatically deferred to social superiors. Immigration, resisted and resented by many, was inexorably changing what it meant to be British, what it meant to be Londonese. The city was becoming cosmopolitan in ways it had never been before. Caribbean music, Indian food, African and Asian cultures, all were beginning to weave themselves into London's fabric. The process was painful, marked by discrimination and violence, but it was also irreversible. London would never again be the monochromatic city it had been before the war. The criminal underworld, personified by the Kray twins but extending far beyond them, had established itself as a permanent feature of London life. The mixing of high and low, the fascination with gangsters, the corruption that ran from East End clubs to Westminster offices, all of this would continue and intensify. The 60s would see the Krays reach their peak of power and notoriety before their fall. But their story was enabled by the conditions of the 50s, by the desperation of post-war poverty mixing with new wealth, by the spaces created when old rules loosened but new ones hadn't yet formed. Women, constrained and frustrated through the 50s, were preparing for revolution. Not all women, not even most women in the 50s themselves, but enough women and their daughters to create a movement that would challenge every assumption about women's roles and capabilities. The domesticity of the 50s had promised fulfillment and delivered confinement. The backlash was inevitable. Technology was advancing in ways that would transform daily life. Television had already changed how people received information and entertainment. The 60s would bring further innovations, better washing machines and vacuum cleaners and kitchen appliances that would actually make housework easier. Contraception would improve, giving women more control over their reproduction. Cars would become more common, affordable, changing how people lived and worked. All of these material changes would enable social changes, making possible lifestyles that the 50s hadn't allowed. The end of national service in 1960 would prove momentous. For the first time since before World War II, young British men wouldn't be required to spend 2 years in military service. They wouldn't be disciplined by military routine, wouldn't be told to conform to military standards. They'd be free to pursue education, careers, creative endeavours immediately after finishing school. This freedom would contribute to the explosion of creativity in the 60s. Musicians, artists, writers, all would have time to develop their crafts without military interruption. Carnaby Street, still relatively unknown in the late 50s, was positioning itself to become the centre of fashion. Small boutiques selling unusual clothes to adventurous young people were opening. Designers who would become famous were starting their careers. Mary Quant, who would revolutionise fashion with the miniskirt, opened her first shop, Bazaar, on King's Road in 1955. Most people didn't notice, but a few did, and they were the ones who would shape the 60s. The Beatles, who would conquer the world in the 60s, were forming in Liverpool in the late 50s, playing skiffle and rock covers in small clubs, teaching themselves their craft. The Rolling. Stones hadn't formed yet, but Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were both in London, both obsessed with American blues, both about to meet. The Who, the Kinks, all the bands that would define the British invasion were coming together, practicing in basements, playing at youth clubs, developing the sound that would dominate the 60s. Meanwhile, London's art schools were producing a generation of young people who thought differently about art, design, fashion. The 1950s emphasis on utility and austerity was giving way to a celebration of style and innovation. Peter Blake, David Hockney and other artists who would define 60s pop art were students in the late 50s, experimenting, finding their voices, preparing to challenge the art establishment. The infrastructure that would support swinging London was being built in the late 50s. More nightclubs, more music venues, more spaces where young people could gather and create. The Marquee Club, the 100 Club, countless other venues that would host legendary 60s performances were opening their doors in the late 50s, establishing themselves, building audiences. The recording studios where British pop music would be created were improving their equipment, learning new techniques, preparing to capture the sounds that would define a generation. British television was getting better at covering youth culture, at reflecting the interests of young viewers. Programs that featured pop music, that interviewed teenage idols, that acknowledged the existence of a youth audience, these were beginning to appear. This would accelerate in the 60s, but the foundation was laid in the late 50s. The fashion industry was recognizing young people as a market. Not children's clothes or adult clothes, but clothes specifically for teenagers and young adults. Shops catering to this market were opening. Designers were creating lines aimed at the young. The idea that fashion should be fun, affordable, constantly changing, was taking hold. This would explode in the 60s, with the miniskirt, with mod fashion, with hippie style. But it started in the late 50s with young people who wanted to look different from their parents and had the money to make that happen. And perhaps, most importantly, people's attitudes were changing. The deference to authority that had characterized earlier British society was eroding. Young people questioned their elders. Workers demanded better conditions. Women, however quietly, began to push back against the constraints of domestic life. The assumption that things would always be done the way they'd always been done was no longer safe. London, in 1959, was superficially similar to London in 1950, still recovering from the war, still dealing with the aftermath of empire's decline. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. The foundations for the 60s revolution were in place. The people who would make it happen were ready. The institutions that would support it existed. All that was needed was for the dam to break, for all this pent-up energy and creativity and frustration to burst forth. And in 1960 it did. The swinging 60s didn't emerge from nowhere. They emerged from the 1950s, from the coffee bars and jazz clubs, from the teddy boys and the first rock and rollers, from the immigrants building new communities, from the women quietly refusing to accept their assigned roles, from the criminals who showed that social mobility could run in dark directions, from the young people who'd grown up in austerity and decided they wanted something better. The 1950s in London were the chrysalis, the 60s were the butterfly, and you can't understand one without understanding the other. The story of 1950s. London is ultimately a story about transformation, about a city and a society moving from one era to another, often painfully, sometimes violently, but inexorably. It's a story that challenges the simple narrative of recovery and rebuilding. Yes, London recovered from the war. Yes, Britain rebuilt, but the city and country that emerged were fundamentally different from what had existed before. The class system was weakening, though it hadn't disappeared. The empire was dissolving, though its psychological impact remained. Women's roles were being questioned, though change was slow. Immigration was diversifying the population, though racial harmony remained elusive. And through it all, London remained London, adapting, absorbing, transforming. The 1950s gave London what it needed to become the swinging city of the 60s, the cultural capital that influenced the world. But the 50s themselves were far more interesting, far more complex than they're usually given credit for. Beneath the grey facade, beneath the rationing and the bomb sites and the austerity, London was reinventing itself. The city that entered the 60s was not the city that had emerged from the war. It had been transformed, prepared, positioned for what was coming. And what came would be extraordinary. Thank you for joining me on this journey through 1950s London. I hope you've discovered a city far more fascinating than the one usually portrayed, a London of contrasts and contradictions, of hope and despair, of darkness and light. If you enjoyed this exploration, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And now, as you drift towards sleep, carry with you images of that vanished London, the coffee bars and jazz clubs, the bomb sites becoming building sites, the immigrants arriving with hope and determination, the teenagers discovering rock and roll, The gangsters in their sharp suits, the women enduring and planning rebellion, the whole vast, complicated reality of a city transforming itself. Sleep well, dear friends, and dream of the London that was, the London that built tomorrow.